took a breath, you breathed your life in me. You've been so kind to me. And oh, the overwhelming, never-ending, reckless love of God. Oh, it chases me down, fights till I'm found, leaves the 99. I couldn't earn it, I don't deserve it, still you give yourself away. And oh, the overwhelming, never-ending, reckless love of God. Yeah. Your foe, still your love fought for me. You've been so good to me. When I felt no worth, you paid it all for me. You've been so kind to me. And oh, the overwhelming, never-ending, reckless love of God. Oh, it chases me down, fights till I'm found, leaves a 99. I couldn't earn it, I don't deserve it, still you give yourself away. Oh, the overwhelming, never-ending, reckless love of God. Yeah. There's no shadow you won't light up, mountain you won't climb up, coming after me. There's no wall you won't kick down, lie you won't tear down, coming after me. There's no shadow you won't light up, mountain you won't climb up, coming after me. There's no wall you won't kick down, lie you won't tear down, coming after me. There's no shadow you won't light up, mountain you won't climb up, coming after me. There's no wall you won't kick down, lie you won't tear down, coming after me. Oh, the overwhelming, never-ending, reckless love of God. Oh, it chases me down, fights till I'm found, leaves the 99. And I couldn't earn it, and I don't deserve it, still you give yourself away. And oh, the overwhelming, never-ending, reckless love of God. And you unravel me with a melody. You surround me with a song of deliverance from my enemies till all my fears are gone. I'm no longer a slave to fear. I am a child of God. I'm no longer a slave to fear. I am a child of God. I am a child of God. From my mother's womb, you have chosen me. Love has called my name. I've been born again into your family. Your blood flows through my veins. And I'm no longer a slave to fear. I am a child of God. I'm no longer a slave to fear. I am a child of God. I am a child of God. You split the sea so I could walk right through it. My fears were drowned in perfect love. You rescued me so I could stand and sing. I am a child of God. You split the sea so I could walk right through it. My fears were drowned in your perfect love. You rescued me so I could stand and sing. I am a child of God. And I am a child of God.
Morning. It's good to see some new people out there today. Hope you guys have a good time. Stick around and eat some lunch with us afterwards. This morning, I want to kind of build on what I talked about last week. Last week, we talked about how some things in the Bible are tough to get, some things in the Bible are tough to understand, and sometimes we get hung up on the difficult stuff and miss the basics. And the basics that we talked about last week were in Matthew 25, where Jesus is given the parable to the sheep and the goats, and he's saying, you know, when you were kind and you took care of the least of the brothers and sisters among you, you took care of me. And also where he summed up all the commands in love the Lord your God with all your heart, love your neighbor as yourself, those basics. So like 3 years ago-ish, Bear was just born, and a couple months later, Katie's life had changed drastically. Before Bear was born, we had a life. We did stuff. We went out to dinner. We hung out with friends. We stayed up late. We took spur-of-the-moment trips. On top of that, she was building her photography business, and she was really successful. She worked a ton. She worked 60, 70, 80 hours a week and had a lot of clients. And basically, we were, you know, the young married couple, but we did whatever we wanted. And after he was born, all of a sudden we weren't calling the shots anymore, and there was a lot of things that we had to do differently, or the things we couldn't do because we needed to take care of him. And it was a big change for Katie, me a little bit, but more for her because her day, every day, got completely turned upside down. And she was struggling with that. And one night we're laying in bed and she said, "What is my purpose?" And I did what every good husband would do at that time. "Oh, hon, you're a great wife. You're a great this. You're a great mother to bear. You're a good photographer." And like, it just wasn't, it didn't work, but like, what are you going to do? That was the best I could come up with. All those things I said were true, but for Katie right then, all the stuff that she was doing, it didn't feel very important. And it was a big change. So, like when we watch TV or we're on the internet or we're whatever, you see all these people that just seem to have a great purpose in life. Like they were created to do this thing and they're just so awesome at it. It's like the type of stuff you'd see in a museum. There'd be a picture and a brass plaque underneath that would say, "Usain Bolt, the fastest man in the world." And there he is, Or Jeff Bezos, founder of Amazon, richest man in the world. It's even better if you can get down to one name, like if you could get down to Oprah or Fonzie or Mr. T. Like when you get to that point where it's just one name, you don't even need a title. At that point, your name is your title. You are that. Those people, it's kind of easy from the outside to look at them and say, well, they obviously had a purpose. And they knew what that purpose was because everybody in the world knew what that purpose was. They were famous. And in the Bible, it's the same way for me a lot of times. I'll see Solomon, the wisest man ever, or Peter, the rock on which Jesus built his church. And then I look at myself and it's Adam Brenneman, salesman. And it's just like so boring, not important at all. So today I want to talk about Ruth, the Moabite. I hesitate to go into the Old Testament because Justin rocks it so well when he does it for us, but we're going to try today. So Ruth's story starts with her in-laws. Elimelech and his wife Naomi had 2 sons, and they lived in Bethlehem. They were Jews, and Bethlehem was in famine, so they moved to Moab to get away from the famine. While they were there, Naomi's husband Elimelech died, so it was just Naomi and her 2 sons. And her sons were Mahlon and Chilion, and they married 2 Moabite girls named Ruth and Orpah. Speaking of Orpah, I think Oprah's mom saw that and just had a typo. Like, I bet she meant Orpah, and she just read it wrong. I don't know. Probably not. Just my thought. So, these Jews moved to Moab, and the husband dies, the sons marry Moabite girls, and then they die. So now it's Naomi, the mother-in-law, and her 2 daughter-in-laws, Ruth and Orpah, the Moabites. So they're living there in Moab, and Naomi found out that things were looking up in Bethlehem again, and so she decided to head back. So they all packed up, and they hit the road. And as they were headed back, Naomi started considering her daughters-in-law and what future would hold for them in Bethlehem. These 2 girls in particular happened to be princesses. So the options were Bethlehem poor widows, back to home princesses. And Naomi, I think being very understanding of their situation, says in Ruth 1, starting in verse 8, "Then Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, 'Go back, each of you, to your mother's home. May the Lord show you kindness as you have shown kindness to your dead husbands and to me. May the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband.' Then she kissed them goodbye, and they wept aloud and said to her, 'We will go back with you to your people.' But Naomi said, 'Return home, my daughters. Why would you come with me? Am I going to have 2 more sons who could become your husbands? Return home, my daughters. I am too old to have another husband. Even if I thought there was still hope for me, even if I had a husband tonight and then gave birth to sons, would you wait until they grew up? Would you remain unmarried for them? No, my daughters. It is more bitter for me than for you, because the Lord's hand has turned against me.' At this they wept aloud again. Then Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, but Ruth clung to her. "Look," said Naomi, "your sister-in-law is going back to her people and her gods. Go back with her." Ruth had a choice there. And what we talked about last week was being faithful to God, and love your neighbor as yourself. You could call it faithful and kind. She had both of those choices right here. She could be faithful to our God, or she could go back to her gods. She could be kind to her mother or not, or mother-in-law or not. She didn't have good prospects in Bethlehem, but prospects in Moab were pretty good in royal lineage and all that stuff. I think it would have went pretty well for her. But this is what Ruth said. But Ruth replied, "Don't urge me to leave you or to turn back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me." When Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her. I think Ruth somehow knew that God wanted her to go with Naomi. But it doesn't say anything about a dream or a promise or an angel or some kind of an oracle to tell her what to do. It seems like she just kind of knew. Her conscience pricked her, or she just had a feeling that was the right thing to do. Ruth's story eventually gets really good, but right now she's a poor foreign widow taking care of an older widow who happens to be her mother-in-law. So if she had a plan or a goal when she got back to Bethlehem, it had to be something like, maybe I'll find a husband and make a life for myself and be able to take care of my mother-in-law. It had to be pretty simple. And I say that because in the passage we just read, it says, "Your people will be my people and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried." So she says, "I'm going to go live with you, and we're going to do that, and then I'll die, and I'll die where you are." It doesn't seem like she's got a lot of expectation in there. So they got to Moab, and Ruth knew they would need to eat, and she knew that Naomi was past her prime for manual labor, so she got permission from Naomi to go out and find a field where she could glean barley. And gleaning, if you don't know, is not the same as harvesting. The harvesters go through, and whatever's left, the gleaners go and get. And my first job, I was a strawberry picker, and I was the harvester. And after me and all my buddies at 11 years old, I don't know what they actually were. We called them the Hooderites. It was some religious group that kind of lived communally, and they came in after we had harvested, and they took everything that was left so they could make jam. And I always thought, man, that would stink. Like, I knew how hard it was to harvest. Gleaning was not a good time. And back then, for women in a field full of men with less than perfect intentions, it wasn't only hard work, it was a dangerous job. So Ruth found a field, and she started gleaning, and it turned out that the field was owned by Boaz, who was a relative of Naomi's husband. And when he found out who Ruth was, he told her she was welcome to glean in his fields anytime. And he said, don't go anywhere else. Don't glean in anybody else's fields. Glean in my fields. You can work with my people, and they'll take care of you and see after you. He even gave her some lunch, and he told his harvesters to leave a little extra behind for her. So Ruth continued to do this work, gleaning the barley in Boaz's field and taking the grain home where she lived with Naomi. And Naomi figured out whose field it was and realized that Boaz must have taken notice of Ruth with the kindness that he had shown her. So she basically gave Ruth some advice on how to pick up Boaz. And back in this time, they had a principle in Judaism called the guardian redeemer, or the kinship redeemer. And the idea was the relative of a deceased man would marry his widow and buy the property and things like that. So long story short, there's a whole sermon in the symbolism of that and all that stuff. We're going to skip that for now. So they end up getting married, and they had a son, and they lived happily ever after. The end. Like it really turned out, right? It's a good story. It's ordinary people. It's ordinary work. Ruth, by being faithful and kind, things did turn up for her. She got married. She had a good life. She had a son. She preserved the family lineage. They all lived happily ever after. That's where Ruth's life ended. Things turned out pretty well. It turned out a lot better than I thought when I left for Bethlehem from my princess life in Moab. So, she probably thought it turned out well. She had upgraded from Ruth the Moabite to Ruth the wife of Boaz and the mother of Obed. Not bad, but it sounds a little like Adam Brenneman, salesman. It's pretty ordinary. But what Ruth didn't live to realize is that Obed had a son named Jesse. Jesse had 8 sons. One was named David, also known as King David. And we know that King David was an ancestor to Jesus himself. So I want to go back to some of the famous people we talked about at the beginning. I like to think that I'm content with where I am, and I am. But every now and then, you look at what other people are doing, or you look at what other people are accomplishing, and you think, oh man, it'd be nice to be involved in something like that. Like, even if I couldn't be famous or didn't want to be famous, it would be cool to work on something that was important, like the space shuttle or something like that. Like, to say I did this and I helped on that, and look what happened. It's hard to do boring tasks when you can't see the big picture. If you're asked to do boring stuff without knowing what you're building, it's just that. It's boring. If you know the end result is going to be the space shuttle, the boring tasks somehow become easier because you think it'll be worth it. It'll be worth it. We're working towards something. Ruth did not know what God was building. She had a big hand in it. She played a great part in it. But she didn't see it coming. She couldn't have seen it coming. She was faithful and kind in the position that she found herself in. Her great act of faithfulness was being kind to her mother-in-law and going with her to Bethlehem. So, from what I can tell, she probably died, Ruth, wife, mother, grandmother. But now we remember her as Ruth, the great-grandmother of King David and an ancestor of Jesus. Some Sundays, I don't always want to come and play guitar or play the drums or preach, and probably you guys wish I wouldn't either, but, you do it. Some Mondays I don't feel like being a salesman. I think, how could selling fiber optic cables and systems that package Cheetos possibly be important? There's no way. There's no way this is important. It doesn't seem important in my understanding, and so I think if it's not important even to me, it can't be important to God. It can't be important, the mundane day-to-day work that I do cannot be important to God. Do you ever feel like that? There's no way this can matter. It's impossible. The thing is, though, that it's where God has us. Where we are now, where we are in our lives, it's where He has us. And I can't always see why, but I'm sure He wants me to be faithful in those places that He has me. Even if the dots aren't connected, even if our story doesn't go down in history, we may be part of something that we can't see. And I would argue that we are part of something that we can't see, and that someday it's going to make sense why we were where we were and why we were asked to do what we were asked to do. But what if it doesn't? What if we aren't working on some big plan? What if all the little ways that we're faithful and kind end up just being little ways that we're faithful and kind? I think it's worthwhile to be Springs Warehouse Church, faithful and kind. And here's why. In Matthew 25, 35 to 40, this is what we read last week. Jesus said, "For I was hungry and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger and you invited me in. I needed clothes and you clothed me. I was sick and you looked after me. I was in prison and you came to visit me." Then the righteous will answer him, "Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? When did we see you a stranger and invite you in, or needing clothes and clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison and go to visit you?" The king will reply, "Truly I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me." So at the end of the day, we might find out, when we get to heaven, we might find out that God had us working as part of some big plan. Or we might find out that it was us being just faithful and kind by taking care of our brothers and sisters. And he says in his word that we took care of him by doing that. That's what he wants us to do. Even if it's just that, that's what he wants us to do. Either way, whether we're working in some big plan or whether we're just being faithful and kind, it can be hard to live that way. But I think the Bible makes it clear that they're both so important. We might be fortunate enough to see how God's working with us, and it might help us to charge forward. Or we might find out in heaven that we were part of a really large plan that we couldn't see on earth, but now that we know, it's so exciting, I got to be part of that. Or we might find out that we served Jesus when we took care of the needs that we saw, the needs that were right where we were. Just because we aren't great doesn't mean we're not important. The face of the clock is where the action is, but the work happens behind it. All the little gears and the little springs and the little things that are unseen. And sometimes I think about myself in that context. Like, what if I am just a little spring in a big clock that I can't see because of where I am? I wonder what God's working on. And because I think God might be using me and working on something with me involved, I better do it. I better be faithful. I better be kind. I better stick with it. Just because I can't see it doesn't mean it's not there and doesn't mean I'm not part of it. Ruth could not see what was coming from where she stood. I'm convinced of that. But it was so important. If you're stuck wishing you had a great part to play that you could see, just remember this from Ruth. It takes more faith to trust God when you can't. If you can do that, I think that's pretty great. If we can trust God and be faithful even when we can't see what he's working on, that's pretty great. Let's pray. God, we thank you for all the ways that we can see your blessings in our lives. And sometimes we can't feel you close or we can't see what you're building. But God, in our weakness, we ask that you would reveal your plans to us. But if not, we trust that you're working through us, and we want to have faith even if we don't feel important or we don't feel like what we're doing is important. Help us to never miss the small things that might be part of your plan, and help us to never turn from someone who might be hungry or thirsty or a stranger or sick. We know if we're faithful to serve in the little ways, we are serving you. We ask all this in your name.